to Kristjan Kaljusaar, who is a doctoral student at Tartu University and is researching the formation of Livonian nobility during the 13th century. Well, and he will speak about survival strategies of Estonian elites during the Livonian Crusades. We know there were different strategies for, on the one hand, that of Kaupo, the quasi-recluse of leaves, and another one of Lembitu, the senior of Estonians, and ironically, they both died the same day, so the strategies didn't help them. But yes, please, Kristjan Kaljusaar, the times they are changing.
Kristjan Kaljusaar is not here.
Oh, not here.
He sent me his PowerPoint and his text at 6:14 in the morning with the word sorry. So I have no idea what happened. Apparently, he's not here. But I can read his paper.
Oh, please. Please, so kind.
So just pretend that I'm Kristjan. So I don't know if maybe it's okay that I go over time because we're gonna ask questions from him. I have no idea how long this is. So please bear with me. I will start now pretending that I'm Kristjan. One of the central elements in the popular perception of Estonian history is the division between German-speaking elites and an Estonian-speaking commoner class or peasantry. So, to a great extent, political and social stratification was paralleled by differences in language. I don't know if this. Okay, no. In order to provide a more accurate historical explanation, this strict separation into German-speaking elites and Estonian-speaking commoners must be taken with a grain of salt. However, as this is, after all, a type of simplification that does not reflect all the nuances that were present in different parts of the population and in different eras. This division, although a very important cultural trait for centuries, was not an absolute rupture running through society. This was especially true in the 13th century, when Estonian society, like the rest of the Eastern Baltic region, was undergoing the transformation from pagan to Christian culture in both a religious sense as well as more generally in different spheres of life and power relations. In this presentation, Kristjan Kaljusaar would like to provide a collection of observations that relate to the various ways the Estonian-speaking elites managed to retain and perhaps acquire power during the chaotic events of the 13th century, at a time during which the former social structures and a previously pagan region were dismantled and, at least in part, replaced by a new dominant religion and culture, as well as the rule of a new foreign overlord, the King of Denmark. So, slide. I would like to start with the so-called survival strategies of the ancient Estonian elites on an extensive scale. The main case would be the strongholds of Lohu or Loone in central Harjumaa, over here, and Varbola, so Lohu, Varbola. Varbola is one of the largest archaeological monuments of ancient Estonia. So these are in the western part of Harrian. Kristjan is using the term power center in a rather loose meaning. By calling them power centers, he takes into consideration a wide array of different types of power, political, economical, ideological, and military. So, in our explanation, we should start with the period immediately before King Valdemar's crusade in 1219, roughly the preceding decade. During that time, military activity between different warring factions was centered mostly on Lohu. The exception is the 1212 campaign of Mstislavich, the Prince of Novgorod, who was an ally of the Germans of Riga at the time. He laid siege to Baldwin. And the local Estonians fought him off with a large quantity of silver. The Rigans, however, led their first campaign against Lohu in 1216. In the following years, Harrians took part in expeditions against the Rigans, but never alone, always in cooperation with either Russian princes, who were soon in conflict with the Germans, or in one case unsuccessfully, with the famous Estonian warlord Lembito. And as you can read from chronicles, successful campaigns provided plentiful and valuable plunder. Hence the risk-reward here was quite beneficial for the Harrians. The large and imposing Russian hosts must have done most of the work, while the Estonians could receive a share of the booty. This meant, among other things, that a lot of power would be concentrated into the hands of Harrian warlords who led these expeditions. We do not have a very concise knowledge about political organization in prehistoric Estonia, but it has been stated in extensive research that plunder economy was important in pre-state societies, not only as a means of amassing wealth, but also as a method for consolidating prestige and power. This is an example of an aggressive strategy, one that empowers the elites through conflict with a dangerous foreign foe. The crusading expedition of King Valdemar in 1219 obviously changed things in Harria. Nevertheless, the efforts of Riga in Harria were still directed against the stronghold of Lohu and never against Varbola. First in 1216 and then again in 1220, with the Duke of Saxony taking part as a counterbalance to the Danish king. Finally, again, after the extensive Estonian uprising of 1222 and 23 in the winter of the year 1224. Varbola seems to have been left alone by the Rigans, but the Varbolensians sought to negotiate with Riga on several occasions. So what are the connotations here? Firstly, of course, that the main conflict appears to be between Riga and Lohu, and secondly, as King Valdemar made landfall with his crusading army, he was initially greeted by the Estonians but later attacked. This has been framed as treachery in the sources, but the idea has been put forward that there were different parties at work here. Those friendly to the Danish king and those hostile. And the hostile ones, so the former, so the friendly ones have been associated with Varbola, the hostile ones with Lohu. So as these are the two main power centers of the region. Also, there are two ancient strongholds in Lohu. So one, known as Lohu number 2, because it was archaeologically discovered later, has been in use for centuries by the time of the Crusades and was rather small. So it's the second one here. The second, Lohu number 1, is bigger. It was initially thought that the large stronghold was constructed in the 12th century, but latest, although preliminary excavations hint that it may have been erected later during the events of the Livonian Crusades. And so during the Estonian Revolt in 1222-1223, new strongholds were built in southern Estonia, and Lohu 1 may have been constructed at the same time. Namely, during the 1216 and 1220 raids, only a village of Lohu is mentioned in the famous chronicle by Henry of Livonia. But in 1224, the main event is the siege of the stronghold of Lohu. So this larger one. Another topic which is connected to this is how the chronicler Henry distinguished Varbolensians from other Harrians. Varbolensians were certainly Harrians in his eyes, this is clear from this text, but they were also a separate entity. All of the previously mentioned expeditions of the decade, of the century, were always undertaken by Harrians. However, during the revolt of 1222 and 1223, which was ignited by the success of the Estonians against the Danish king on the island of Saaremaa, but started in Varbola on the mainland. Henry also speaks only of Varbolensians explicitly. He does this in connection to them besieging the still Danish-held castle of Tallinn, not once, but on 2 separate occasions over the course of the year 1223. He makes the specific distinction that this was undertaken by the Varbolensians. So now where is Kristjan going with this? Well, first, why were only Varbolensians besieging Tallinn in 1223? Perhaps because the Estonians of Lohut were preoccupied with building the new and massive stronghold, Lohut 1, which in turn hints that the local elites, perhaps specifically one, perhaps many warlords who had consolidated their power during the expeditions of the previous decade, that these elites could muster the resources to organize the construction of a much larger stronghold than was in Lohut previously. So, second point, the military efforts of the Germans of Riga had been, without exception, directed against Lohut and not Varbola. Hence, perhaps, when Henry spoke about Harrian raids, these were mainly organized by the warlords of Lohut. This does not mean that no Varbolensian war bands or warriors took part, but that the leaders were the elites of Lohut. Now to present a oversimplification, and it is certainly far too basic to be a conclusive model. We could interpret this as a more warlike, aggressive approach by the elites and Lohut, by the elites of Lohut, and a more diplomatic, conciliatory strategy by Varbola, who tried to initiate negotiations with the Rigans and later with the papal legate, and who had especially good relations to the Danes. So the Danes not only took residence in Varbola in the beginning of the 1220s, but also gave Varbolensians a siege engine, so a stone throwing machine. This was quite bizarre, since firstly this gift was immensely valuable strategically, and secondly its exact intended function is quite obscure, because usually it was used to besiege castles, not defend them. So meanwhile, Henry in his chronicle criticizes King Valdemar for sending Harrians to raid the neighboring province of Järva, so here, in 1220, with the aim of forcing the Estonians there to accept Danish baptism and not Rigan one. So presuming that the chronicler followed the proposed logic regarding demonyms, these may have been war bands from Lohut continuing the pillaging strategies which they had employed against the Rigans previously. The difference was that now they acted under Danish royal protection, which shielded them from Rigan retaliation. Hence, they could make the new situation work for their benefit as well, so the ones from Lohut. Now, so in contrast, the Varbolensian siege engine would have been quite useless during pillage raids, and the province of Järva lacked notable strongholds altogether. So it could have served as a protective measure against the Rigans. It is known that the Estonians of the stronghold of Viljandi, not on the map, so somewhere here, around here, in southern Estonia did use siege engines defensively in 1223 against the besiegers. So however, it could have been intended for use against other Estonians, such as the elites in Lohut. So Varbolensians may have operated as the local authority representing royal power in Harria, where Danish administration had otherwise not been established. As for example, Hans Jakob Orning and Björn Poulsen have pointed out, Danish kings traditionally employed two main strategies to consolidate power: building royal institutions around existing local authorities and creating new elites from men of lower social standing. So both could have simultaneously been used in Varbola. Native elites were the pillar of the royal power, and former elites would achieve a stable position in the hierarchy of the Danish realm. It is not hard to imagine an arrangement made by the Varbolensians that would have elevated them to dominate over all of Harria and perhaps further with royal backing. So for some reason the Varbolensians turned against the Danish king in 1222 and 1223. It may have been because of the new forms of taxation, or perhaps they were convinced by the success of the Osilians of Saaremaa when they rose against the Danish king in 1222. So the Varbolensians apparently tended to negotiate and side with whoever was the strongest party in the region at any given time. In 1220, it seemed to have been the Rigan Crusaders with the Duke of Saxony. After that, the strongest one seemed to be the Danes. In 1224, the Rigans again. In 1226, the papal legate. So in 1222, they may have thrown their lot in with the brewing Estonian revolt. Now, so these are some examples of survival strategies on a macro-historical level, and so I'm only at the halfway of the presentation at the moment, so how much time do I have left?
Oh, 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Okay, then...
it's very interesting.
So that we just go on. So, macro-historical level. So Kristjan would like to cover some more specific options that were open to specific individuals. So let's skip forward to 1227, when the Rigan military order of the Sword brothers took control of northern Estonia. So in the well-known Liber census Daniel, what about it in English? The Danish census book, King Valdemar's survey. Sorry. So in King Valdemar's survey, there is a vassal named Albert de Osilia, who had been given an average-sized knight's fief in Harrian by the Sword brethren, but had fled northern Estonia when Danish rule had been restored in 1238. So he was almost certainly a native Osilian, since there are no traces of enfeoffments to Germans on Saaremaa in this early time, and hence he is an example of horizontal social mobility of Estonian elites. So Albert the Osilian could be connected with the events of the crusading campaign against Saaremaa in the winter of 1227. So this is the early part of February. So, at some point thereafter, the Rigans sent a letter to Lübeck, which was at war with the Danish king at the time. And the Germans of Riga asked it not to make peace with a separate peace with the Danish king, so here's the quotation, because the Osilians had received the letters and joined their cause and were willing to provide aid in this war against the Danish king. So there's no reason to consider this as some sort of tongue-in-cheek comment painting the subjugation of Saaremaa in the terms of forming an alliance. The Osilians had surrendered on very favorable terms, and native elites apparently continued to govern the great autonomy well into the 14th century. So, despite the defeat in the winter of 1227, new opportunities presented themselves to the elites of Saaremaa. It would be quite natural to assume that the Osilians would be interested in taking part in a campaign against their old foe, the King of Denmark, in northern Estonia, so with the Rigans. So it is very important to note that the influence of warriors may have been somewhat or even greatly confined by the possibly rather collective power structures of prehistoric Estonia. In Saaremaa, the occasionally rising influence of an equestrian warrior was apparently stifled. So hence, becoming a vassal of the Sword brethren offered Albert quite alluring vertical social mobility as well, by integrating into a power system free of traditional Estonian constraints. So also, despite the fact that ancient Estonia had a rather sophisticated system of taxation, it is likely that the new so-called European power structures and the creation of fiefs allowed for much more efficient economic resource extraction. To present a quite questionable comparison, some estimates assert that around the turn of the 14th century, English royal administration could occasionally receive as much as 300% more funds from subjugated Wales after replacing local taxation systems there with fiefs and a new fiscal organization of their own. So fiefs mean more profit, is the argument. So in Estonia, new taxation was one of the main reasons for native revolts. And in 1245, for example, the Roman Curia scolded vassals in Estonia for the excessive tributes they demanded from neophytes, so recently Christianized people. So hence the creation of a system of fiefs could likely provide increased revenue and a more stable social status for those members of the ancient Estonian elites who could become vassals. The question was, however, whose vassal would it be reasonable to become? For those Estonians who were not happy with the rule of the Sword brethren in northern Estonia, The early 1230s presented a new opportunity when the papal vice-legate and later legate Baldwin of Alna was dispatched to Estonia. He built up a quite impressive power network of his own in northern Estonia, which also included members of the native Estonian elites. In this regard, Kristjan would like to draw your attention to this map by Paul Johansen, the known Danish Estonian historian, which demonstrates areas where the sword brothers gave out fiefs to their vassals. The region of Revala in the north mostly, but also around the stronghold of Varbola. So a vast majority of these fiefs were revoked upon the restoration of Danish rule after the Treaty of Stensby. So Reval is here. But I really don't know where the other place names are on the map at the moment. Sorry. Where are we? So a vast majority of these fiefs were revoked upon the restoration of Danish rule in 1238. Now, why the fiefs around Varbola? We don't know much about what happened there when the sword brethren seized Harria, but judging by former examples, it could be presumed that some sort of deal was struck. We might consider, however, that Varbolensians supported the papal legate, Baldwin, whose influence came to an end in 1233, when the sword brethren allegedly massacred his supporters and vassals in Tallinn and destroyed his main power bases. Among the fiefs around Varbola, one belonged to a certain Arnold, who has been identified as Arnoldus Villicus, known to have sold his fief in Paderborn to a local nunnery in 1231 and then left for Livonia with his wife and children. If this is true, then he could not have been enfermed here much before 1233. Hence, perhaps the Sword brothers made rearrangements in the region after the violent events of the year 1233. There is a variety of reasons why Varbolensians may have taken the side of the papal legate Baldwin. For example, if they had commercial interests around Tallinn, their position may have been hurt by the decision made by the Sword brethren to invite merchants from Gotland to settle in the newly founded city. By the way, these merchants were given fiefs in the province of Järvia, so Järvamaa, and it is known that Järvian Estonians supported the legate Baldwin because he revoked these enfeoffments. The decision made in Varbola at that time probably had several motivations. We do not necessarily need to seek a monocausal explanation. Finally, Kristjan would like to look at the lower level of power relations, those centered on local, one could say, village elites. Around the year 1240, under Danish lordship, we have an example from northwestern Harria about a man who was certainly Estonian, more specifically Osilian. His name is Herman Osilianus. So Herman Osilianus is connected to the village of Karjaküla, which consisted of 5 plowlands. So here, this one is Karjaküla. And the plowland was the standard agricultural unit, roughly corresponding to one farmstead, or, an area that one could basically cultivate with one plow, you'd say. So Herman possessed one plowland legitimately, that is as fief from the king Valdemar II, and he held 4 plowlands non-arega, so not from the king, but they were in his hands. What we might assume is that he had received this one plowland in some form of ownership from the Sword brethren already, when the Sword brethren ruled Harrian. And then he had somehow expanded his power during the confusing times when the power was given over from the Sword brethren to the king of Denmark. So, regarding the period of the Sword brethren rule, the King Valdemar's census book lists 3 villages in the area, and so these are the red dots, 3 villages, and which were held by 5 liegemen, so 5 vassals, in an unclear format. the fiefs were not connected to a specific vassal. The villages were Karjaküla with 5 ploughlands, Engla with 10 ploughlands, and Humala also with 10 ploughlands, so a total of 25 ploughlands. So it has been recently assumed that each vassal held 5, so 5 ploughlands from these fiefs, and one of them probably had held the village of Karjaküla. So, and these 5 men, they all left northern Estonia as Danish rule was restored. So, where would that leave Herman? So, in Kristjan's opinion, this would be an example where the topmost layer of crown vassals, so the tenants-in-chief, is pulled back, and we can see traces of a lower, more local power network underneath them. Because he said Herman possesses 1 ploughland as a fief from the Danish king. So he had, in all likelihood, the king had in all likelihood approved Herman's claims to this 1 ploughland. But looking at the fiefs from the period of the Sword rule, it seems that there should be a vassal with a fief the size of 5 ploughlands here. So hence, perhaps, the enfeoffment was made to a vassal of the order who resided elsewhere, and Herman originally functioned as some sort of local administrator who would exercise authority on the spot and take care that the vassal, who may have perhaps lived in Tallinn, would receive his revenue. And in return, Herman was given this 1 ploughland as payment. So it would be quite simple to imagine how this sort of local authority could have extended his power over the lands of the fief, which were not originally given to him. So if the top vassal left, then the administrator took the whole fief to himself, basically. That's what Kristjan argues. So, and he says that we have some hints toward a similar situation from another area in Harrian, from southeastern Harrian, the village of Raveliku. It was 18 ploughlands, so the village is here. 18 ploughlands held in fief by a certain Bertald Campanelli, perhaps originating from Kampen in the Netherlands. But then the record reads Et Wauae 1. Now this could be the small settlement of Varbola, here, that the vassal possessed next to Raveliku. But it could also be a personal name. It could also be a Fenoric name, Vane. We know another Vane from the Chronicle of Henry of Livonia, and hence, for whatever reason, the record could be alluding to an Estonian who held this 1 ploughland, perhaps as a local administrator. In 1469, this small settlement, actually just a single large farm, was called Veneküll, village of Vene or village of Vane. And to add another uncertain detail, the Estonian name Vardja means warden or custodian. So in conclusion, Kristjan says that the strategies employed by the native Estonian elites manifested on different levels of power structures or different levels of society in general. There is actually no concise way to summarize them, as native Estonian elites were present as actors in various structures of authority. This ranged from ruling over centers of government in a new system of lordship, as seems to have been the case with Varbola, to ensure personal or family level success via aiming to secure the status of a vassal in the new political structures, and finally to consolidating one's power on the level of the local elite, which in a sense technically meant even more immediate authority over a community than the crown vassals may have possessed. So, thank you. I'm going to leave conclusions here, I think. Oh, okay. So that's all for me. So please give up.
So, thank you very much. It seems to me that we cannot ask any questions.
we may still discuss on the topic because we have time to discuss.
Maybe there's somebody who wants to say something on the subject. No, probably. very convincing, but perhaps I overlooked something. So it's better to read it.
Yes, it is.
So properly. So now the time it's left is 15 minutes for discussion, but perhaps we could start our coffee break earlier, or what do you think?
Yes, could we start our coffee break earlier? Yes.
So, and it was on the third floor, or?
I hope that it's already ready.
Uh-huh.
And the coffee is for all. All of you, kindly ask you to join us on the third floor.
Thank you. Well done.